Israel rejects calls for an independent inquiry into the killing of Palestinian protesters. Is Netanyahu playing hardball with Hamas or covering up human rights abuses? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is the deadly protests at the Gaza border. Palestinian leaders say Israeli soldiers are guilty of indiscriminate murder. Israel's defense minister says they deserve a commendation. They're both talking about the same event last week, when tens of thousands of Gazans gathered under blockade to vent their anger. It marked Land Day, the anniversary of when Palestinian land was expropriated decades ago, and it kicked off a 6-week rally called the March of Return. The protesters threw rocks and burned tires near the border fence. Israeli guards responded with tear gas and live ammunition. Hundreds were wounded, and at least 17 people have died so far. Human rights organizations are calling for an independent inquiry, but the Israeli government has rejected those demands. In a moment, I'll question one of the Prime Minister's top deputies. But first, this report by Natalie Pohernan.
Running with a tire. Shot with a bullet. Abdel Fattah Abdel-Nabi was killed in the Gaza Strip last Friday. He's one of at least 17 people who've died as a result of their injuries. Up to 30,000 Palestinians had made their way to the border fence with Israel, demanding the right of Palestinian refugees and their descendants to return to their lands, which are now Israeli territory. Organisers wanted this to be a peaceful protest to mark the start of a 6-week campaign for recognition. But it turned violent. The Israeli military says it fired using live ammunition according to its rules of engagement, after it says Israeli troops along the border were fired upon and protesters threw rocks. Israel says at least 8 of those killed were members of Hamas.
What we've seen is a violent riot in its clearest form. The Hamas terrorist organization have sent their people here to camouflage their true intentions, and we've seen that on the ground, just behind where I'm standing right now.
The UN and the EU have called for an independent investigation into the violence. The Israeli Defense Minister, Avigdor Lieberman, says there won't be a commission of inquiry. He says soldiers did what was necessary. Among the injured is 12-year-old Bashar Wadan. He was hit by gunfire.
I was just standing there when I felt something hit my leg and it pushed me to the ground.
Palestinians have previously marked Land Day to remember territory confiscated by Israel in 1976. But this protest, called the March of Return, has drawn crowds from across Gaza. The right of return appears to be uniting Palestinians of all ages. They've set up tent cities at 5 points along the buffer zone with Israel. A peaceful yet prominent act of protest.
They're hoping. They say that the old will die and the young will forget. But no, the young are children sitting here saying they want to go back to their families' lands, the lands of their fathers and grandfathers. They want to go back. The young have more ambition, more than their fathers and grandfathers.
But will young Gazans ever be able to realise that ambition when sovereignty is at stake on both sides of the fence? Natalie Pohernan, The Newsmakers.
Well, I'm joined now from Tel Aviv by Michael Oren. He's the Israeli Deputy Minister for Diplomacy in the Prime Minister's office and used to be the Israeli ambassador to the United States. Good to have you on The Newsmakers, sir. As a diplomat, when your army kills at least 17 people, protesters, over the weekend, it's not a good look. Was it a massacre?
It most definitely was not a massacre. Keep in mind, Hamas is not like any other state. Hamas is a terrorist organization. It is committed to Israel's destruction. The so-called protest was not designed to bring about peace. It was designed to break the border and to kill Israelis. And Hamas didn't make any attempt to dissemble this, to hide this in any way. And it was willing to use civilians and to infiltrate armed terrorists with the civilians to break through the border. All of those killed, all of them, were picked out by our sharpshooters because they were attacking our soldiers. 11 of them are officially terrorists of Hamas. So these aren't innocent protesters. These are armed terrorists trying to kill our civilians. We have to protect ourselves.
Is there any evidence that they were armed and an imminent threat to your soldiers?
Yes, there is. I mean, 4 of them attacked a tank with guns. We have automatic weapons that we took from them. Another 4 placed IEDs, roadside bombs, to kill people. They were using these civilians as human shields, as Hamas has done repeatedly in the past.
Wait, hold on. So were they civilians as human shields, or were they terrorists, or were they both? I'm struggling to follow.
No, the terrorists are using human shields. Listen, this is not the first time this has happened. Hamas took over the Gaza Strip in 2006. They fire rockets from inside civilian areas. They build tunnels under civilian areas to attack us. This is their modus operandi. This is how they operate. They use children. They sent a 4-year-old girl up to the border on Saturday to deflect fire from their terrorists. This is what we're dealing with.
But how do you know that the intentions were to send the girl as cannon fodder? Again, how do you know that the intentions were to send the 4-year-old girl as cannon fodder to be killed by your soldiers?
Well, the girl was not killed by our soldiers because our sharpshooters are very good. Let's be clear about that. Again, everybody who was killed, all those killed on the other side, were engaged in active hostilities against our soldiers, and 11 of them are actually listed by Hamas and Islamic Jihad as armed members of their organization. So these are not innocent protesters.
Okay.
And the head of Hamas in Gaza,
you say your
Mr. Sinwar, said openly that the purpose...
You say your sharpshooters are really good.
Let me finish, please. That the purpose of the protest was so that the demonstrators could go over and eat the livers of Israelis. Eat the livers of Israelis. Now, if you had that type of terrorist on your borders who's going to eat the livers of Turks, would you expect your army to defend your borders?
Do you have any evidence that any soldiers were on the verge of having their livers eaten by protesters with tires?
Hamas has killed well over 1,000 Israeli civilians. Over 1,000. Proportionally, that would be many.
But we're talking about 17 Palestinians.
This is a terrorist organization.
Certainly, sir. We're talking about 17 Palestinians who were killed over the weekend. No Israelis were killed. And if you'll allow me to go through the figures, 1,479 Palestinians injured, including 805 shot with live ammunition.
According to Hamas sources.
So you don't believe the hospital figures from Gaza as well?
I have never believed the Hamas figures, and I have much experience with those figures being grossly inflated.
My point
is, 17
you say the sharpshooters are really
I'll
good.
agree with you, 17,000 killed, but who are they?
You say there's precision. I'm asking you, everyone who was either injured or killed, did they deserve it?
They did not deserve it, but Hamas bears the responsibility for it. Israel doesn't. If Hamas is driving people up to the border and say, go to the border, Hamas knows full well what our border policies are. We have to secure our borders. We have civilians on the other side of that border. Now, I imagine Turkey would understand this.
No, certainly.
You have been bombing villages along your border indiscriminately for a long time.
I know you're keen to bring up the Turkey analogy here, but let me ask you, you say you have to secure your borders. Do you have defined borders?
Is it unfair?
Do you have defined borders?
Oh, we actually have a defined border along the Gaza border. We withdrew from
Israel's
Gaza
borders?
in 2005.
What are Israel's borders?
Israel's borders has one internationally recognized border in Lebanon. It does not have an internationally recognized border to the West Bank. That is under negotiation. It has an international border along the Egyptian Sinai border. Yes, we do have recognized borders, and we have a maritime border. Right now, the only border that is not internationally recognized and supervised is the West Bank border. But we hope that that can be solved in negotiations with the Palestinians. But again, we're not talking about borders. We're talking about terror. We're talking about defending ourselves against terror and what a sovereign state has to do to defend itself against a terrorist state, a terrorist organization. That's perfectly legitimate and in accordance with international law.
If there is dispute over the numbers and over the intentions of the IDF soldiers who have killed at least 17 people and wounded hundreds more, as there is, would you be open to an impartial investigation to find out what happened over the weekend?
The IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, will always investigate itself. And Israel has a world-class and world-respected judicial system. We need no outside judiciary to investigate. And as of today, as of this interview, the IDF has determined that all of its soldiers, all of our soldiers, acted in accordance with regulations, open-fired when they determined that there was an immediate threat to our soldiers, to our borders, and we're standing by that. And by the way, I'll make the stronger point that Israel is actually going to beef up its forces on the border as a result of this recent clash with the Hamas terrorists. And we're going to ensure that the Hamas cannot get anywhere near or certainly penetrate our borders.
Michael Oren, thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Let's bring in our Ubay Shabander now. Ubay, we've just heard from the Israeli government. They're taking a very hard line on this. Tell me why.
Well, this is the largest such demonstration in Gaza in recent memory. The Palestinians are referring to it as a March of Return. Some are even referring to it as a Passover uprising. So it's interesting to see here that the Israeli Defense Forces are, as you said, are taking a very hard line here. Around 18 have been killed. Now, the Israelis are saying that most of those are either militants or directly threatened Israeli soldiers, or the wall that they've set up to essentially encompass and close off Gaza. The Palestinians are saying that most of those have been killed were merely demonstrators, youth. They were just throwing rocks, some Molotov cocktails, but they never put the Israeli military in direct danger. The Israelis, as you said, are not backing down. This is potentially a PR disaster for Israel, as many in Israel itself are taken aback at the reaction by government forces against the demonstrators, especially with some of the harrowing footage that we're seeing coming out of those protests that are more than likely going to continue.
And it could be both, in the sense that Hamas, of course, could be instigating things, but that doesn't mean that the people who are being killed are not peaceful protesters, right?
Indeed. Now, Hamas has acknowledged that at least 5 members of its military wing were amongst those that were killed. But overall, if you look at the mass of the protesters that are there, they're demonstrating in just wide open field. It's wide open. There's no cover. You can clearly see who is armed, who is not armed. Most of those protesters were just burning tires and simply or throwing rocks. But the response was from the very beginning. In fact, before the demonstrations began, the IDF declared that they were going to use live fire. So it was clear that there was a existing intent by the IDF to use maximum force against these demonstrations.
Yeah, on the left in Israel, Gideon Levy writing in Haaretz saying tanks and sharpshooters against unarmed civilians. That's called a massacre. There's no other word for it. That's on the Israeli left. He's an unpopular man in Israel at the moment and swims against the tide when it comes to a lot of what the army does. Jerusalem Post with an op-ed. They're on the right and I guess pro-government. They're saying Hamas is using the demonstrations to undermine and delegitimize Israel. It doesn't want its people to have hope for a better future. The last line is the most fascinating. It prefers they be shot and killed by Israelis. This narrative that the Palestinians are sort of coming towards the Israeli army and wanting to be killed like zombies, if you like. Tell me how prevalent that is.
Look, when people have no hope left, then they have nothing to lose. And that's exactly what the situation in Gaza is like today. When we speak to activists, when we speak to civilians and students in Gaza, the same narrative is heard over and over and over again, is we have no hope, we're enclosed, we can't leave, we can't have a chance for a normal life. So when you give people no hope for a better future, then they have nothing to lose. And that's the worst case scenario for the Israelis when you have a population of millions in a densely populated area, one of the most densely populated in the world, essentially losing hope because of the blockade that the Israeli government has instituted against the people of Gaza. Now, at the end of the day, the Israeli military is going to win any direct confrontation with Hamas in Gaza. But it's Hamas a battle of public opinion and international
Hamas is not
opinion.
fighting them now, is it? I mean, they're claiming it's asymmetric, right? But it's, I mean, you spoke about that border. It's like a couple kilometers and then a fence and a couple kilometers, and you have snipers and soldiers and stuff there. Like, there's no direct conflict in terms of Hamas and the Israelis right now. But they're still calling it a conflict with Hamas. For how long will their allies, for example, the United States and others, accept that narrative?
Well, I think if we see continued days of the footage that we're seeing that came out over this weekend of youth being shot and killed, of innocent protesters being shot and killed, it's not going to be a winnable solution for the Israelis. It's just not sustainable. And I think that's ultimately what the strategy is here by Hamas, is that they know they can't win against Israel in any direct confrontation, but if they're able to rally the masses, where we're seeing just a mass of people at the border protesting, calling for to live a normal life in Gaza. These are images that the Israelis, at the end of the day, they cannot win this war of international opinion. Now, if the casualty numbers significantly increase and spike, again, this is something that the Israelis are going to find themselves in a lose-lose situation. We're already seeing some protests in Israel against these actions. But at the end of the day, it is going to be the Palestinian people that are going to suffer one way or another. But many of the Palestinians that we're speaking with tell us, well, we have nothing left to lose, so why not?
Given that the Israelis have killed at least 17 of the protesters, and even though, I guess, 5 have been Qassam Brigades members, and we have had hundreds of civilians injured. Given that it's happened, is there an argument to be made that Hamas is being reckless by encouraging people to go forward because they know they're going to be shot by the Israelis?
Well, the intent by the Israeli forces was clear from the very beginning. They made it very clear to everyone that they're going to use live ammunition. Hamas knew that. The organizers of these protests knew that. But what happened at the end of the day here is that the people had nothing left to lose. When you can't, force people by the hundreds to protest, if at the end of the day, well, some may actually prefer death or even the potential of dying or being shot by the Israelis rather than living a life without dignity. And so this was a very easy decision by Hamas to make against the Israelis.
Yeah, terrible situation in Gaza in terms of living conditions and so on. We were there last year. From the Palestinian perspective, if they go, well, if we fire rockets and we are violent, you ask, where's the Palestinian Mandela? Where are your peaceful protests? Now, they are peaceful protests, by and large, and they're still being labeled as terrorism by the Israelis.
Terrorists and rioters. So it's interesting to see the narrative that's being used by the Israelis.
So what does that do in terms of, from the Palestinian perspective? Well, clearly they don't feel the other side has any semblance of good faith, because even when we're protesting largely peacefully, you're picking us off and you're calling us terrorists.
Well, then you make a popular and perhaps a violent uprising inevitable. And that's a lose-lose situation for the Israelis when you're leaving no other recourse for the people to claim their rights, to claim their dignity. And that's a situation that the Israelis may ultimately face themselves with if they don't offer the millions of Gazans and the Palestinians an opportunity to live a normal life. And in fact, so what's happening here, even if the Palestinian protesters don't support Hamas or they don't support Hamas's agenda or political ideology, they're left with no other choice.
Right. How's this going to affect Abbas and the PA in the West Bank? Has the rug been pulled from underneath their feet? And is the momentum politically with Hamas now in terms of Palestinian support?
Well, therein lies the irony, is that the hard-line position by the Israeli military against the protesters in Gaza puts Abbas in a very difficult position. Right. And you're the one partner that you could potentially negotiate a peace deal, two-state solution, where you can finally give the Palestinians an opportunity to live in their own state and live in dignity, could potentially be undermined by these actions.
Okay. TRT World's defense analyst, Obey Shabander. Thanks so much. Coming up on the Newsmakers, Daesh might be defeated in Iraq and Syria, but is the terrorist group winning a war in Afghanistan? And after years of protests, Ethiopia's Oromo community gets a bigger say in politics as one of their own becomes prime minister. It's almost been a year since the United States dropped what was called the mother of all bombs on Afghanistan. The hope was to wipe out Daesh there in almost one fell swoop. But since then, the terror group only continued to launch deadly attacks in and around Kabul. And that's despite what the US calls a number of successful raids. So while Daesh militants may have lost their self-proclaimed caliphate in Syria and Iraq, could Afghanistan become their new launch pad? Christine Pirovalakis reports.
We're knocking the hell out of ISIS.
America's efforts to defeat militants in Afghanistan appears to be a never-ending battle.
Part of the policy is definitely ousting ISIS from Afghanistan, and we spent a lot of time supporting that and working towards that goal.
For the past year, U.S. and Afghan forces have increased their firepower against Daesh from the air and the ground. The U.S. has bombed its hideouts, including dropping its largest non-nuclear bomb on a Daesh stronghold last April in the eastern province of Nangarhar. 94 militants were believed to have been killed in that attack. And recently, American raids killed 2 leaders from Daesh's affiliate in Afghanistan, called Islamic State Khorasan Province. Despite battlefield defeats and senior leadership losses, Daesh remains a resilient threat. Even with the arrival of new U.S. troops and aircraft, it's continued to carry out a string of bombings. And a renewed recruitment drive has seen the number of its fighters quadruple to 3,000 in the past year, according to the U.S. military. Daesh may have been all but defeated in Syria and Iraq, but the threat that the group poses in Afghanistan is real. Islamic State Khorasan Province was founded in 2015. It's made up of mostly Taliban defectors and militants from Iraq and Syria. The Taliban is estimated to have full control of 14 of Afghanistan's 400 districts and has a presence in up to 40% of the country. Daesh doesn't have the influence that the Taliban has, but it's still managed to gain serious ground, controlling several pockets close to the border with Pakistan in Nangarhar. The group has been involved in dozens of high-profile attacks since 2016. It carried out at least 14 major attacks in Kabul last year. In January, it took credit for an attack on an office belonging to the Save the Children charity in the eastern city of Jalalabad. And recently, it bombed a cultural center in western Kabul, killing at least 40 people. While the group has come under intense attack from Afghan commandos and American airstrikes, is the world losing the war against Daesh in Afghanistan? Christine Pirovolakis, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Kabul by Javed Faisal. He's the deputy spokesman to Afghanistan's chief executive. And from Washington, Omar Samad. He's a former ambassador and a former spokesman for the Afghan Foreign Ministry. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Javed Faisal, let me start with you. Daesh, in some respects, makes the Taliban look quite tame by comparison. Is Daesh your fundamental threat in the country right now?
I believe Taliban remain to be the biggest threat to security in Afghanistan. Daesh is something strange to Afghanistan. They are not having the same culture or respecting the same culture that Afghans do. Their religious beliefs are different than the ones of Afghanistan. They have not been able to gain the respect and attention of the people that other terrorist groups or mainly Taliban have had in the past. So we here believe that Taliban remain to be the main threat to Afghanistan, not Daesh, because in the past 2 or about 3 years we were able to take care of them in the areas where they were able to gain ground.
Okay,
not
but you
anymore.
say that, okay, but
past years,
if it allow me to come in there, right? You say you're taking care of them where they can gain ground. A year ago, the US military said there are 700 fighters. Now, just at the end of last year, the top NATO commander said that they had killed 1,600 fighters. It doesn't add up. If there were only 7, why were 1,600 killed? And now at the moment, these guys continue to conduct attacks on Shia mosques, cultural centers, shrines, you name it. Sunni, Shia, unbelievers to them, whoever, right? So the fact that you're saying that you're taking care of them, it seems as if we don't even know the numbers, and it also seems as if they're willing and capable of attacking with impunity.
The main problem with the numbers is that it's not only Daesh. As we have been saying, we are fighting 20 terrorist groups in Afghanistan. There are other groups who have joined Daesh. There are drug mafia who are supporting Daesh or somehow are being called part of Daesh. there are groups from Pakistan-based terrorist groups who are fighting under Daesh in Afghanistan. That's why you cannot say. But we have been killing them. We have been using all our force against them. There is no ground for them. There is no space for them among the people. And they have not been able to have footprints in areas more than they were there before. They were somehow in 7 provinces in Afghanistan before, but today they are only in 4 provinces of Afghanistan.
Okay, so let's take that and pose it to Omar Samad.
In there, they are supported by Taliban.
Okay, fair enough. So we have Omar Samad, we have Javed Faisal saying, we're beating them, we're killing them, and we're containing them. Is that how you see it?
Well, I think on one hand, that is what the Afghan forces and their allies have been doing over the past couple of years or so. But on the other hand, I believe that Daesh, as we call it in Afghanistan, it's called IS or Daesh Khorasan province, and it's sort of split into 2 distinct groups for the moment, and it might change. It's an evolving situation, an emerging situation in Afghanistan, that they are also, in my opinion, looking at Afghanistan as an opportunity, as a space that they could occupy wherever there's a vacuum. And what we see are those who have raised the Daesh flag, who belong to the region, to the closer region to Afghanistan, mainly former Pakistan Taliban, some members of maybe former Taliban themselves, Afghan Taliban, who are more radicalized and have, for whatever reason, joined this Daesh KP. But also what we see are enclaves of Daesh who are foreign fighters coming from far away places such as the Middle East, Central Asia, Caucasus, and other places, including Chinese Uyghur fighters who have joined, Uzbek fighters who have joined this so-called Daesh. So
but
we have
we've
these
seen,
2 phenomena
we've seen this movie before, haven't we?
Emerging.
Ambassador Samad, we've seen this movie before. Foreign fighters given a safe haven in Afghanistan with global ambitions, not local ambitions like the local Taliban. Isn't that exactly what happened with Al-Qaeda and exactly what precipitated 9/11?
Well, I mean, yes, you can go back to the 80s and 90s and draw some analogies. There may be some analogies. The situation is very different. The players are different. Right now, you also have linkages to what I would call regional powers and rivalries that stretch from the Middle East all the way maybe to Ukraine and other hotspots where the Americans and the Russians are rivals, where India and Pakistan is rivals, where, for example, Iran and the West are rivals, and so on and so forth. So what Afghans are concerned about is that their territories would be again used by any group, any terrorist group, any radicalized group, whether you call it Daesh, whether you call it Taliban, whether you call it by any other name, for nefarious purposes and for destabilizing Afghanistan and using Afghanistan as a springboard or using Afghanistan as a sanctuary.
But
and I think that the Afghan government needs to do everything possible to prevent that from happening.
Do you make that distinction between the Taliban and Daesh? We heard Javed Faisal make it a little bit earlier on, saying it's difficult for them as Daesh to sort of take root in the society because they seem to be this kind of foreign export or foreign import, if you like. Do you make that distinction between the Taliban and Daesh?
So the Daesh brand that we see with those 2 different factions, as I explained earlier, do have some dissimilarities with Afghan Taliban, but it's part of a whole larger network, in my opinion. And I think that there are linkages at some levels, especially when they rely on foreign patronage. When they rely on foreign patronage, could it be money or arms or training or sanctuaries, then there is a possibility, as we saw with Daesh in eastern Afghanistan, having certain linkages with groups that are based in Pakistan. And we see that emerging. So we see also Daesh in northern Afghanistan with foreign fighters having linkages with maybe countries and maybe organizations and terrorist organizations and criminal organizations that stretch all the way to the Middle East.
Any countries in mind?
Well, I cannot pinpoint to a country, but I think that Afghanistan is a victim of a proxy war. And I think that this proxy war is waged mostly by so-called ghost organizations or intelligence organizations or deep state organizations that have certain objectives that have to be met. Now, the Russians and the Iranians say one thing. There's a lot of conspiracy theories that are being flown around. The Afghan government obviously has its own view of how things are. The Americans have their own view of how things are. The Pakistanis are now getting into this game and starting this blame game as well. And if you look at other countries beyond Afghanistan's borders, they each have a certain claim. And so what needs to be done is we need to all sort of agree on what kind of a threat Daesh Afghanistan or Daesh KP is to everyone, right, in which we can find commonality and work to make sure that it is eradicated.
Javed Faisal, talking about the international players involved, the Russians quite blatantly say that the Americans and the Afghan government downplay the threat of Daesh in your country. They're right, aren't they? You guys are downplaying it while Daesh is much stronger than you say.
I would not agree to what has been said by the Russians, because we have been using all our force against Daesh. We have been fighting all terrorist outfits without any differentiations. Against Daesh, the United States used the biggest bomb ever, and that was a big example of our commitment to fighting against Daesh and all other terrorist outfits.
But that happened 1 year ago.
The countries in the region.
And sorry to interrupt you. That happened 1 year ago, and that was supposed to have smashed them and destroyed them. They've only re-emerged stronger. Sergei Lavrov saying, according to our data, that's the Russian data, the IS presence or Daesh presence in northern and eastern Afghanistan is rather serious. There are already thousands of gunmen. And they say the US and NATO and Afghanistan makes every effort to silence and deny this presence. Doesn't he have a point?
I believe our information, or the information given by the United States, should be credible in information given by the Russians. We are here on the ground. We are fighting them on a daily basis. And we have not been differentiating. And if we come to the comparison, a year ago, they had the power to fight on the ground with our forces. But today, they do not have the force to fight against our forces on the ground. All they do is to carry out side attacks. All they do is to blow themselves up among the busy locations in Afghanistan. And they are killing all innocent civilians. They no longer have the force to fight. So I believe they have become weaker than they were a year ago, and they will be destroyed here, they will be finished here, and there is no space for them, neither within the people, neither within the system or within the government. We are fighting against them.
Omar
we are not differentiating between them.
Okay, so Omar Samad, we have the Americans. They dropped the mother of all bombs. They've sent in special forces. Their airstrikes killed 2 leaders of ISIS Khorasan, as they call them. We have all of this happening, and on the other hand, there's a conspiracy theory related to the Americans allowing Daesh to flourish. I didn't just get it from any old man on the street. It was from the former Afghan president himself who told me on this very program last year. Have a little listen to what Hamid Karzai had to say.
They kept watching it, while the Afghan people kept coming to us and complaining of how Daesh was behaving and doing things.
So they knew, but they did nothing?
They not only knew, they watched. They cannot tell the Afghan people that they didn't know. The airspace is in their hands, the communication is in their hands, the area is under their complete, absolute surveillance. There is no way that they can excuse themselves or offer excuses in this regard. No, we don't believe it, and they are to blame.
Omar Samad, is Hamid Karzai just, I don't know, being polemical just for domestic purposes, or does he have a point that the United States allowed Daesh to flourish in Afghanistan over the past few years?
I am of the view that Hamid Karzai and a few others have their own opinion about this, which is not substantiated. I have not come across anything yet that shows that there is a conspiracy by the West or by the United States to impose Daesh for certain purposes against other countries. At the same time, we also need to make sure that other countries' claims have proof and evidence. We can't just continue with this game, which, as I said, is mostly a proxy geopolitical game, by making these kinds of allegations we need hard proof. Now, what we do know so far, as I said, is that there is a Daesh presence in Afghanistan. There are two types of them, as I said, and that each has its own objectives, and they have their own networks that they are affiliated to. And so countries and those elements within countries that want to use Daesh for a certain purpose will obviously come up with a narrative. And so you have a war of narratives on Daesh brewing around Afghanistan. What needs to be done is we need to come on the same page. We need to find, as I said, a certain sense of what the threat perception is, what the threat reality is, and what needs to be done to get rid of Daesh, whether it's one type or the other type.
Understood.
And I think that it needs a lot of diplomacy, and it needs a little bit more engagement across the board. What I'm afraid of is that if something happens in the Ukraine, then Daesh Afghanistan, one brand or the other, is activated. Or something happens, let's say, between Iran or another country, or Russia and another country, then Afghanistan becomes a target or becomes a platform for waging this kind of war, and that has to stop.
Okay, gentlemen, unfortunately, I've got to wrap. There's a lot of anxiety and uncertainty with regards to Daesh in Afghanistan at the moment. I'll have to thank you both. I hope you'll both come back to the Newsmaker sometime soon. Omar Samad and Javed Faisal, thanks again.
A lot has happened, and a lot of people have lost their lives. The new Prime Minister has to communicate and listen to people, to know what people want. It's the most important thing. He has to pay attention to the voice of the people.
After months of civil unrest, a state of emergency, and the surprise resignation of a prime minister, Ethiopia has a new leader. Abiy Ahmed is a member of the Oromo people, the ethnic community behind mass protests against government oppression that have often turned deadly. But while Ahmed is the first prime minister from the Oromo tribe, he's also considered an insider with the ruling party. So can he unite a nation, or is he providing cover to keep things just the way they are? Well, joining us from Washington is journalist Mohammed Ademo. He's the founder and editor of the news website Oromo Pride. And we have Bronwyn Bruton. She's the deputy director of the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. I thank you both for joining us. Mohammed, let me begin with you. The last time I spoke to you, you were not too keen on some of the government's actions with regards to what was happening in the Oromo region and so forth, and the protests and the state of emergency. Are you willing to give credit where it's due now, given that there's a new prime minister who's inspiring a lot of hope for a lot of people?
Yes, but the credit goes to the protesters who brought the new prime minister to power, not the other way around. If you remember the last time we spoke, he was newly elected as the vice president of Oromia Regional State in large measure as a way to respond to those relentless protests. And the protest essentially swept him to power, and he's done some good things along the way to get to where he is right now. But ultimately, today is a good day, is a hopeful day for Ethiopia, and that is largely because of the sacrifices of democracy activists, and in this case, especially the Oromo protesters over the last 4 years.
Bronwyn, do you agree with that it came from the protesters and eventually the state had to listen?
Absolutely. There's no question whatsoever that this is not business as usual for the Ethiopian government. The election of a Oromo prime minister and also a young prime minister, I think, speaks volumes to the effect that the protests have had. It's really unprecedented. And I think that Mohammed is correct to sound a note of caution. We don't know whether Dr. Abiy is going to be successful in instituting real reforms in Ethiopia, but there's no question that this is a watershed moment and that the protesters have really accomplished something that few of us thought to see.
Yeah, so Mohammed, it's clear that the sting, I guess, has been taken out of some of the trouble for the moment in the short term. That can only be a good thing. What can he do? And I know this, there's going to be confirmation in a couple of weeks and he has to announce his new cabinet and so forth. What can he do to give you the strong indication that perhaps the political and economic marginalization of the Oromo people is coming to an end?
The list is very, very long, and it's mostly the demands that protesters have been putting forward. But I think one thing that is very important in this case is there are two centers of power in Ethiopia today. That is the power of the people and the power that comes from the security military establishment. And this is a young leader, largely seen among the Oromo as a reformer. He takes over a country that is deeply fractured, a ruling party that is deeply divided in ways that we have not seen in its entire history. So I think he faces very, very challenging road ahead. But the first thing he can do really is to lift the state of emergency, which he did not vote for when Parliament voted earlier last month. And that will give him the civilian powers that he needs, because the state of emergency gives power to the military, which essentially makes his role, his position for the next 5 months ceremonial. So unless the state of emergency is lifted, none of the things that he talked about today in terms of talking to the opposition, opening up the political environment, reaching out to opposition and dissidents in diaspora, and reforming the economy, none of those things are going to materialize as long as the military is in control. The question really now is how much of the things that he talked about today in his very inspiring speech that the establishment, the deep state, would allow him to put to work.
Right. And Mohammed, is it possible that he's going to face resistance from the deep state, as you call them, or the military establishment? Is he going to face resistance to taking that state of emergency off the table for Ethiopians? Might that be a problem for him?
Yes, there is no question that he's going to face a resistance, because if you look at just the way his election came about, the establishment, in this case, the Tigrayan Liberation Front, People's Liberation Front, TPLF leaders who control the security in the military, campaigned vigorously against him, a very open campaign, and of course a lot of relentless attack internally, according to sources, where he was criticized and demonized and accused of enabling a color revolution, which basically meant that he was willing to listen to the protesters. So there is no question that he will face resistance, but he has power, he has leverage that comes from his broad-based support, which cuts across ethnic divides, across even political divides. If he leverages that support and use that leverage against the military establishment, I think he has a chance, he has a historic opportunity to remake Ethiopia anew and ensure that a new era of democracy and equality can take hold. But he will face resistance.
Yeah. So, Bronwyn, we have Mohammed calling it a deeply fractured society. We have others saying that the dream of Meles Zenawi, you know, of ethnic federalism has failed. A lot of people are deeply divided in terms of tribe in the country. Is it going to be easy for the Tigrayan minority, or those in power who come from the Tigrayan minority, to take their hands off the levers of power?
No, I think it's not. I mean, I think Mohammed's done a very excellent job of pointing out that effectively this is a compromise gesture by those individuals who are maintaining power now. But it remains to be seen how far they're going to go. The lifting of the state of emergency is very important to the protesters. And I think it's something that's going to be very difficult for the hardliners within the Tigrayan elite to agree to. If they don't, then I think optimism will wither very quickly and you'll see people going back on the street. And so what Dr. Abiy has to do is persuade these individuals inside of the military, inside of what Mohammed has called the deep state, that it is in their interest to let him make some very meaningful, very visible reforms very, very quickly. Effectively, his appointment has bought time. But if it isn't followed up with concrete action rapidly, then the situation will deteriorate.
Mohammed, how much of a priority will it be to try to seek justice for alleged human rights violations and extrajudicial killings?
I think he will have to be very careful about what to make a priority. I think there are a whole bunch of things he can do, and justice is very important. I think the country needs healing. It needs a national consensus, a national dialogue. But I think that needs to come first before going after some of these generals and others who are implicated in egregious human rights abuses as documented by human rights organizations. But the most important thing he needs to do now is release the remaining political prisoners who are in jail, release the prisoners who have been rearrested less than a month after they were released under a government amnesty. Start there and then reach out to the opposition, sit down and chart a future that includes the opposition, because this government has been in power for 27 years and they cannot solve all the problems. The problems are money alone, and they need to seek partners from the opposition, from the protesters, and I think eventually go forward by reforming the judiciary, freeing it from the shackles of the executive branch, and then and only then justice can be sought, because as it is, the judiciary, the courts, are doing the bidding of the executive branch. They have been doing the bidding of the executive branch. That needs to change before we can talk about justice.
Okay, very finally, Bronwyn, when he names his cabinet, will it have to be a compromise cabinet that includes the old and the new to try and balance things?
I think that it has to be. It's wonderful to think of him coming in and replacing all the old TPLF stalwarts with young people and reformers and enthusiastic new minds. But the reality is that this is a very delicate balancing act, and there has to be a feeling of security on both sides. The protesters have to feel that things are changing, but I do think that the old guard in the TPLF also has to be reassured that their interests are being protected. Otherwise, again, the situation is so fragile that I think you could easily see a reversion to the status quo. For many, many years, when Hailemariam Desalegn was the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, he had no power at all. And I think that in a worst case scenario, what you'll see is that Dr. Abiy will overreach and that you'll revert to this, this status quo of the Prime Minister effectively being a fig leaf for others who are operating behind the scenes. He does have support from the Oromo people and from others, many others in the Ethiopian society. But I don't know how effective that's going to be if he goes too far too fast. It's a very, very delicate line that he has to walk.
Okay, well, we'll be watching his tenure very closely. Abiy Ahmed, the new Prime Minister, he'll be sworn in very, very soon. For the moment, Bronwyn Bruton and Mohammed Ademo, I thank you both for joining us on the Newsmakers. Talk to you soon. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, the Syrian regime says it has struck a deal with the rebels to leave eastern Ghouta. Is Assad centimeters away from winning the war? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.